Hi everyone. So we are talking about something I think more on the artistic issues side of the software development world than what we've seen elsewhere today. And we're Toby and I are both working in an area which we've started to think of using the term musical meta-creation, which I think we can credit to our colleagues in Simon Fraser University, Philippe Pasquet and Arnie Eigenfeld. But it's been known by various other names, such as live algorithms for music, or some people would recognise this as algorithmic composition and so on. And it's the generation of spooky sounds around us, as if something's been generated. It's the generation of musical behaviour in. I tend to describe it as basically some way that relates to autonomy. So, extremely guarded language. We talk about autonomous music performance systems, but we're very guarded about what we mean by autonomy because it would be sensible to do so when there's lots of conceptual issues to deal with. So to frame what we're interested in, here's something that's a kind of useful reference point, which is the work of the kind of futurism of Ray Kurzweil. In 1999, he did us the kind service of making lots of very fanciful, sometimes quite accurate predictions about technology in the future. And we can work backwards. 2099, the reverse engineering of the human brain appears to be complete. So that's the kind of point. I guess that would be his singularity, where we don't need to worry about doing any of this software development stuff because it's done. But if we work back, these are comments he made about autonomous music, autonomous creative art systems, and he talks about music and art. So we've already passed the stage where he predicted that human musicians would routinely jam with cybernetic musicians. We did a concert in 2009 at Cafe Otto in London, where we got a bunch of people making this kind of software together, and it certainly wasn't a routine thing. It was very unusual. And coming along 2019, virtual artists in all of the arts are emerging and taken seriously. So we're not really on target with this, but it is interesting actually that Kurzweil might be an order of magnitude out, but there is this progression that people are working towards. But we would argue that this is a very simple appraisal of the situation, and of course, as you delve into these subjects, they break down and they break apart, and we start to understand them in slightly more subtle and different ways. So what is an autonomous system, and when is it acting independently of its programmer, and how on earth does it engage in creative practice? This is just a kind of really sketchy history of the kind of work that is leading towards where we're at the moment. So, for example, the work of Voyager by George Lewis and Cypher by Robert Rowe, the LAM group set up in Goldsmiths in 2005, which had kind of major events associated with autonomy. And we see maybe some patterns in the kind of history of this stuff from early experiments with electronics and cybernetic behavior and so on, early computational work, the kind of rise of the personal computer and Macs coming out of Ercam and all this kind of work where individual composers are starting to work with computers. And there's a bit of a big data thing going on. So possibly you could look at that in terms of a kind of model of technological development such as the Gartner hypercycle, where you've got expectation kind of rising sharply about what you might be able to do with the technology, but then a bit of a crash when you realise that it doesn't work as well as you'd like. And then a more realistic kind of rise in focus and interest in that work. So the history of Mume-type work might be seen in terms of these kind of hypercycles of interest. And at each stage, people seem to run aground a bit about what autonomy means and how it works. So I'm going to wrap up this. This is the intro. I'm going to wrap this up really quickly and hand over to Toby, who's going to talk about one of his own pieces. And I'm just going to skip this because we're improvising. We're improvisers. And the two things we're really interested in are the systematic analysis of our systems, but also the human observation. We're working with human performers, and what we're talking about today really is about the human side of performance and how we might analyse how our software works and how we develop it in the future. Over to Toby.
Thanks, Ollie. Like Ollie, I'm from Australia, a researcher in computational creativity, so the interface of machines with creative production in some form. And I just want to do some reflections on what it means to be a researcher in this area and what data means, what kind of data counts, if you like, as research data, how do you evaluate these things. Of course, there's been a long history of discussion of how to evaluate computational creativity or artificial intelligence and so on. But I would suggest that in the creative arts realm, there's kind of some different considerations that come into play than, say, in an artificial intelligence context. And I found this certainly when I started my PhD. I had a background in maths and a bit of linguistics. Went away and did a bunch of stuff, and then had a midlife crisis and enrolled in a computer music PhD in a school of music, and was quite at first bewildered by the humanities approach to epistemology, to research, to what they thought of as a robust validating data and so on. Yeah, it was really quite a polar shift certainly in my thinking. And I discovered doing this interdisciplinary research where what I was doing was trying to build some software that you could jam with. So you play your instrument, play the clarinet, and kind of listens and bops along and improvises some accompaniment. And it was very interesting being in that kind of humanities, or particularly fine art area as a researcher, doing what was essentially software development, coming from a kind of a maths headspace. And interestingly enough, in the creative arts, there's been an ongoing battle which seems to be won, at least in Australia and I think in the UK too, to accept the idea that a creative work can be a piece of knowledge. It's kind of embodied knowledge, ineffable knowledge that is communicated best through the medium in which you create it. And so now in the School of Music, and we can put up pieces of music or performances as research outputs. You know, you can do a little blurb about, framing it and so on, but nevertheless, that's the case. And so in my PhD, there were a lot of people who were just making a play or doing a painting, etc., or a series of exhibitions. But what I was doing was writing software. And from a computer science perspective, the idea that you would hand in a piece of software as your knowledge is, to my understanding, not really accepted. It's not about the software, it's about what that software has, taught you about the world in some way, what new things you've realised, and the software was just a way to get there. And yet, that really was my artwork, was making this piece of software. And so there's this question about, with SoundSoftware and people using it, what is the software, what is the piece of art, what is a composition? But for example, with Max patches or PV patches, many people will make a custom patch for a particular performance. And so is that patch the work, or is it software? It's kind of a blurry line. Maybe you can use bits of that patch for other pieces, slightly altered and so on, but it really does kind of bring into question whether software itself is data, how you evaluate it and how you think about it. And like Ollie, as I was saying, I was interested in this kind of autonomous systems, and been doing some further research with creative partnerships between machines and humans playing music, and kind of interested in, so this interactive music systems or musical meta creation field has long discussed a kind of a spectrum from what we call hyper instruments, which someone was referring to just before, over to a more artificial intelligence approach where looking at computational musical agents. Kind of this spectrum. So over here, you've got complete autonomy and you're just improvising music with another musical agent. And over here, you've got a digital system which you're completely in control of in some sense. And what we're really interested in is somewhere in this middle ground where it's not completely autonomous. You have some kind of control over the system, but at the same time, it's interacting with you in a kind of an agent-like manner. So it's rather like more broadly, this desire to have effective agents and so on in computing, where you feel like you're not just interacting with this robotic, I suppose, interface, but there's some kind of level of cognitive engagement with another agent. So we built a system, and we were really interested in whether we could make something which people, when they were performing with it, had a sense of performing with another musical being. And let me play you some examples. How do I get over this? Or an example anyway of... So we had a concert where we had 5 different musicians playing with our system of really quite varying styles.
You're not on the...
I really need the picture anyway. Let's make it play. That's the magic button. I'm sorry. It might take a while for the agent to kick in on that particular one, but the point is really more, there you go, more to show you the kind of diverse sorts of inputs that we were looking at. So as a second example, cool, that'll do for that. So really, the point I really wanted just to make with that was that we had just really diverse styles of music that we were trying to have improvised with a computational agent. There was another guy who played some jazz piano, and someone else who did a kind of a classical thing. And it really becomes this question of, well, how are you going to go about evaluating a computational agent as to whether it's doing well or not? Is that something you should evaluate? Does it even make sense? And But you know, being researchers, that's what we wanted to do, and so we set up a bunch of interviews with the performers and also audience surveys as to A, what they thought of the musical quality, and B, did they get a sense of there being two identities in the audience. And I think the point that really comes out for me is that what needs to be considered with these kinds of research is the importance of context. So, such different genres of music evoked completely different feelings as to whether this agent was performing in a kind of a musically intelligent sense. And I think that's kind of generally true with musical performance or creative systems. If you're trying to assess whether a work is successful or not, then it's not the kind of thing that necessarily is reproducible. You know, because a concert is a concert, especially when it's improvised, it does what it does, people react to it the way they do, and so, anyway, I don't really have any answers. I'm just problematising the notion of a kind of a reproducible data approach to evaluating systems like this. And on that note, I'll hand back to Ollie.
Okay, so yeah, we're thinking about very similar things, and just kind of heard. So, well, an inspiring researcher in this field, who many may know, is Francois Pachet, who's done a well-known system called the Continuator, and he's looked at how people interact with that. And basically, where we're heading to, I feel, with this field is that what the kind of research we need to do, the kind of core empirical research, is very much HCI related, but it's a very kind of exotic form of HCI where musical meaning in the interaction between the musician and the system needs to be understood. And as Toby said, that's a very kind of something that's very much grounded in a cultural, ethnographic reality, or ethnomusicological reality as well, because of the way that the musicians have built up their own way of speaking about things. Pachet's got some really nice video, and his outputs largely consist of just basically presenting these systems in interaction with musicians. But he's got some wonderful stuff where he just decides to do this with kids instead and just see what the kind of experience they have is. And those videos, if you haven't seen them, are really worth checking out, because just as a means of data gathering, just as a form of data, observing the interaction, and not necessarily trying to quantify that, but just to kind of observe the types of interaction and the types of response you're getting from people in a sort of user experience sense is really valuable. And I think this is quite old work, and it's taken me a long time to realise in my work that that's the way that it does work to frame stuff. I probably don't have time to play another piece. What I'll do actually is just cut straight to... oh, there's a piece. I'll play a tiny bit quickly, sorry. Yeah? Sorry, slideshow error. So the clarinet player from Canada, Francois Huel. And that's playing with my kind of ongoing software system, which I call Zamintin. And you can see a video of that as well online. So in discussion with Francois, it's been interesting to look at the way he conceptualizes improvisation, and then how he approaches interacting with that system, and trying to tease out the kinds of language and the kinds of measures, or at least qualitative kind of critical elements that are going to create a valuable user experience and a musically meaningful interactive experience. So you've probably had a bit of time to read this, and you can see, I mean, this kind of language that Francois is using to describe what he values in improvisation is not particularly easy stuff to then go and say, well, this is the specification I need to write a piece of software. So there's very much an ongoing interaction between the way that you're thinking about a musician performing and using this as a tool, which we don't tend to do in meta creation. We tend to think of ourselves as artists producing autonomous systems, but really these are much more easily conceived of as tools. So this is ongoing work. We did a concert last week at Cafe Otto, which was a kind of repeat performance of the 2009 gig. And we're continuing both to work with different musicians and to understand this language and iterate the design process and treat it, for me at least, treat it increasingly as a sort of exotic HCI challenge. So Francois giving interview feedback, which I'm analysing at the moment, about how interacting with that system is working. So we're running over, so I'll stop there. Thank you very much.
Okay, questions?
Clean slate.
Right. You were talking about evaluating the system. Is there anything like a Turing test for musical creation, in the sense that you would make someone listen to a musical piece generated by the computer and whatever artificial intelligence we put with it? If that's the case, then that would mean that what you're evaluating is the anthropomorphism of the system. Is it what you're trying to achieve, or are you trying to achieve something which is creation outside of any similarity to what a human could produce?
Okay, so that's a very popular question, and the answer is no. And the problem we're trying to address is how to come up with sensible approaches, given that the answer is no, I think, in short. So the Turing test just really doesn't carry to this situation. And, I mean, it doesn't carry because music is not a sufficient window as language is into intelligence. Although there are musically intelligent things you can do. So there is potential for human-like musical interaction to be measured and identified. But I firmly believe that I believe that the Turing test doesn't carry at all into a musical context. It just sort of falls apart.
Well, and I sort of also think that it's not really what we're trying to achieve. If I wanted to jam with a musician, I'd jam with a musician. There's plenty of them around. And so what I guess we're aiming for is something that is not human, but is interesting to play with in some way. Of course, there's clearly a research agenda that could be had about, can you code something that could pass as a human musician? So I'm not quite as sceptical about the possibility of a Turing test being an interesting thing, but I certainly don't think that it is the measure that applies to what we're trying to achieve.
Any other questions? So I had one question about the point of view of the evaluation. So sometimes you might get a different sense of what's successful or interesting or useful from if you're the performer, or if you're a skilled or a musically experienced member of the audience, or a musically inexperienced member of the audience. How do you differentiate these different audiences, if you like, from the evaluation?
I think that's a good question. You clearly need to, or at least you need to know the context in which the answer is being made. One thing that is really common is just to read in abilities to a system that it doesn't have. If a performer starts playing with the system and then starts saying, it's tracking this, that's really clever, and you go, well, no, it doesn't. I know it doesn't, because it's not programmed to do that. So that's an interesting thing, I mean, obviously they're just guessing, and like any person interacting with the world, they're maintaining their best hypothesis of what's around them at any point in time, and you're presented with this system which you can partly analyse from a cognitive perspective. So that becomes really interesting. And I guess your knowledge of programming and also your actual access to the information. So an audience member watching an interaction has a very different understanding of what just happened to the musician who's engaged in the interaction. They know that they can probe and try things out. So yeah, it's important, and we don't have a kind of explicit methodology for breaking that apart.
But I think in practical terms, it means that there's a really important to get qualitative data as well as, did you like it? Yes, but what did you like about it? And also get some kind of sense of who the person is. where they're coming from as to how that plays into what their perspective is.
Okay.
By the way, I'm sorry about that alarm just now. It was supposed to be just giving me a rough timing.
That's fine.
That was a mistake.
Anyway, so thanks very much again. Thank you.
Thank you.